Hello and welcome back to another video of Company of Heroes 2 with some historical background for the units that are in game. Today we are going to talk about the USF, the United States Forces, and I am going to tell you something about what the units were for, which units there are in game, and what is realistic about them and what's not so realistic about them. So let's start with the starting unit of the United States Forces. They are the rear echelon troops. They are meant to construct stuff. They are like the engineers for the United States Forces. And what you can see here is that they look like infantrymen dressed up for winter. They are wearing the long coats. The long coats were handed out to the United States Army for winter situation. For example, in the Battle of the Bulge, several units received these coats. Other units received these coats very late and were thus not very much prepared for the cold climate. But these long coats were meant to keep the soldiers warm from the neck to the knee, as you can see right here. The helmet is the M1 helmet. It's the standard United States infantry helmet. And the weaponry that they are carrying is the M1 carbine. The M1 carbine is a semi-automatic carbine, and it's the bullets are being loaded into the carbine by this magazine here, and if you have to reload, you can just let the magazine go and then put in a new one. The rear echelon troops have the function of the engineers in game, but apart from the fact that everybody who plays Company of Heroes 2 knows this, you can't really see anything in the equipment which is pointing this function out. Like with the German Pioniere, you can see the scissors on their backs. Of course, you can upgrade them with the hazard removal package, but this gives one of them a minesweeper, and that's it. It means that they can also cut barbed wire, but for some reason the scissors are not present on the model, and I'm not sure why that is. The rear echelon troops are called this way because they are not meant to fight at the front lines. They are meant to stay in the rear and do the construction repair work over there. They have in Company of Heroes this ability which is called volley fire, and this means that all the carbines are going to fire at a certain target to suppress it. This is you could get suppressed by carbine fire, but the caliber is pretty light, so it's nothing compared to the suppression that a machine gun or rifles could give. The rear echelon troops are able to lay barbed wire, build tank traps and fighting positions. They are also able to lay M7 light anti-vehicle mines. What you can see here is this is a mine which is being put in the ground. The pressure tab is this square plate on top, and it explodes when the vehicle drives over it. It's not a very huge explosion that you get because the charge is not so big. Okay, let's continue to the standard American infantry. They're called the riflemen, and the riflemen are the backbone of the United States Army. They have the same helmets, the M1, but their uniform is for better weather. You can see that they don't have the long coat. Instead, they have the olive drab uniform, which is kind of standard for the United States Armed Forces. The weapons they have is the M1 Garand. It's one of the most famous weapons from World War II, and they have a very distinct reload sound, which we are going to demonstrate by putting down an enemy close by. Let's put down a infantry unit from the Germans here, and then make it an enemy. Okay. What you can see right now is that the guys are firing at the grenadier. And there you heard the distinct ping, and you also see that the something is jumping out of the Garand rifle, and it's the empty clip of the Garand. Okay. Well, all the Germans are dead. The Americans won this fight. They are with 5 guys firing semi-automatic rifles. When the last bullet is spent, you hear the distinct ping sound. The empty cartridge will jump out, and you have to put in a new one. These cartridges are the bullets. They are being held in these pouches over here, which are around the waist in the standard American uniform. You can also see that at the legs there are these bandages. They are meant to keep dirt out of the boots. This is pretty old-fashioned, and World War II was the last war in which this was used extensively. The rifleman can also be upgraded, and
frag grenades now available for action.
And the rifleman can be upgraded with several weapons. And let's put some weapons here, like this one. This is a standard weapon for the rifleman to get equipped with. This is the BAR 1918 automatic rifle. BAR, B-A-R, stands for Browning Automatic Rifle, and it was developed during World War I. It has a small magazine with about 20 bullets, and you can see that here is a bipod which is already deployed. When a rifleman would fire with the bar undeployed, then the bipod would be folded up. Of course, the firing stability would increase with the bipod folded out, and that would mean more accurate firing for the rifleman. I didn't talk about the standard weapon layout for US Army infantry platoons, but a normal infantry platoon in the time that is being portrayed in Company of Heroes 2, which is Battle of the Bulge, and afterwards, is about this size. Because a platoon would have a number of squads, usually 2 rifle squads and 1 weapon squad with special weaponry, and the squads would consist of about 10 to 12 men. So actually I would need 4 guys more here, and I could equip one more with another bar to make it look better. So let's do that for just because we can. Another rifleman squad and another bar.
Nuts. We got orders coming. Okay, move it along. Secure that
So,
weapon. Move it out. Let's go.
so this looks almost like a normal squad in the American Army in World War II. What's missing is the Thompson for the squad leader and the grenade launcher for the assistant squad leader. Well, I said this is the backbone of the American Army. In the game Company of Heroes 2, you can upgrade these riflemen with the bars and with bazookas from the weapon rack in the base, and on certain commanders you can also upgrade them with M1919 machine guns, which is not very common in normal rifle platoons. The M1919 was much more common in parachute units, about which we will talk now.
Steady up, men.
Here is a paratrooper unit, and I'll move them a bit more in the open here, because the paratrooper unit is very well done when it comes to the model. You can see that the paratroopers are also equipped with the M1 carbine, and the M1 carbine is the standard weapon in game. It's not the most common weapon to have jumped with, because usually the paratroopers were jumping with weapons like the Thompson. But like I said, you can upgrade them with M1919s, or you can upgrade them with 4 times the submachine gun. So let's do the submachine gun, and the M1A1 Thompson is the most common submachine gun in World War II for the American Army. It was also used by other armies, but mostly by the Americans. M1, you might have noticed that all weapons are starting with the letter M and the number 1. Until now, M1 Carbine, M1 Garand, and now the M1A1 Thompson. M1 means Model 1. So if the Americans were producing a new weapon and it already existed in a certain category, let's say a rifle, then it would become model number 2, so it would become M2. M1A1 means that the A stands for alteration, so the M1 Thompson was altered with minor changes to the weapon itself, and that became the M1A1 Thompson. Okay, let's put here another paratrooper squad, just so we can upgrade them with M1919s, so we can see what that looks like.
Looks like we're going in. Get us that 30 fellas.
Here we got the M1919, which is a realistic weapon for paratroopers. The paratroopers were equipped with these weapons in the late war, in Battle of the Bulge, and later on. The realistic thing about this is that there would be an M1919 in the paratrooper squad, but the unrealistic thing about it is that there would be only one. Other paratroopers would be equipped with the M1 carbine, the M1A1 Thompson, a bar automatic rifle, several Garands, and sometimes a sniper rifle, which was usually not a semi-automatic rifle, but it would be a a bolt-action rifle. The bolt-action rifle is not in this game, so I'm not going. It was called the Springfield, by the way, but I'm not going to talk about that a lot because it's not in Company of Heroes 2. So I was saying that the paratroopers model was pretty well done, and we can see that over here. What you can see is that there is a unit badge on the shoulder, and it's a black badge with a bald eagle on it. It's the unit insignia of the 101st Airborne Unit, and it's a nice detail that they put that one in game. You can also read the Airborne tab over it, which is one of the tabs that you could have in the American Army. What's more realistic about this is that the helmet is the M2 helmet. This is the paratrooper helmet. It has a little difference here next to the ears, because the M1 helmet goes a bit lower, and that's a disadvantage for paratroopers because it could get tangled up in the ropes of the parachute. You can also see that the M2 helmet has netting, and the netting was meant to be able to put camouflage on the helmet, like this guy has. Other details we can see on the model is this bag here. It's a first aid pouch. It's pretty useful to have your first aid pouch up for grabs when you are jumping out of a plane, usually in the middle of the night. And then if you can't find it, just grab your head and you will have it. There's also a pistol holster. And is there a guy who can show his pistol holster readily? Yeah, this one here. And the pistol holster contains an M1911 Colt pistol, and it's the most common weapon hand weapon in the United States Army, and some soldiers in the United States Army still swear by the M1911. The M1911 can't do everything by itself. It also needs magazines, and the magazines of the Colt and the magazines of the Thompson are in these bags over here, these little light greenish bags. It's a very nice detail. What else we can see? What's missing on the model are the jump gloves. The paratroopers were jumping with gloves because the ropes of the parachute would otherwise maybe cut your hands, which is not very nice. We see that there are grenades here on the straps. While they were jumping, the grenades were not there because that would be pretty risky, but they could put them up there after they had safely landed on the ground. There's a jump uniform specially made for the paratroopers, and that's what you can see here. It's different from the riflemen. There's a knife here strapped to the boots, and the boots were also different than those of the regular army units. Paratroopers were designed to be able to fend for themselves in enemy territory for a longer period of time, and that's why paratroopers were also considered pretty tough guys. And the 101st Airborne Division is most famous for the Battle of the Bulge because they were defending Bastogne, because that town, which is in peacetime pretty insignificant town, was strategically of a high value in World War II because it has a road junction with about 7 roads coming together. And the Germans had the town surrounded, and in Christmas 1944 the paratroopers were defending it on on very thin supplies. General Patton was rushing in with his armored divisions, and they were lifting the siege in early January 1945. Maybe you have heard the famous story of General McAuliffe getting a note by the Germans that was asking for the surrender, and he just read the note and simply said nuts and threw the paper away. So no surrender for the 101st Airborne there. The paratroopers can't really function properly if they don't have the support of a special unit which is called the Pathfinders. We can see the Pathfinders here. In game there's two types of Pathfinders, the normal Pathfinders that you can see here and the INR Pathfinders, which you can see here. Right now you might think, okay, what's the difference? Well, in the model there actually is not really a big difference. In the icon you can see there's a cross here. The INR Pathfinders are in-game different because they are able to call in artillery support. In real life, INR probably means intelligence and reconnaissance. The Pathfinders had the task to jump ahead of the main force of paratroopers. So they had sticks of a stick is a group of parachutists, and the first sticks of Pathfinders they would jump ahead of the main force. They would secure the landing zones. They would set up beacons, which is a possibility in game as well. You can let them build beacons, and the beacon would just send out a signal to the planes that were about to arrive, and those would then be able to drop their paratroopers earlier. Not earlier, but more accurately, of course. The weaponry of the Pathfinders is also carbines. It might be that the Pathfinders were equipped with M2 carbines in the last days of the war, but in 1944 they still had the M1s. What's interesting here is that you can see this guy, and if you notice, he looks like he's having a M1 Garand with a scope. The unrealistic thing about that is that scoped Garands were not used in World War II. They saw action first in the Korean War, and so that's a little bit out of reality for the Pathfinders in game. The Pathfinders look like paratroopers. The uniform and the equipment is almost the same, except for the fact that they have radio equipment here with a field telephone for communications, because that was their main task. There have been Pathfinders since Operation Husky. Operation Husky was the big paratroop landing in Sicily, and a lot of paratroopers landed in wrong places or were scattered over wide areas, and because the resistance on Sicily was not super heavy, this meant that the Americans could learn from it, and so they invented the Pathfinder unit to make sure that scattering like that and misdrops like that would not happen again. Okay, well, before we go to the officers, let's go to some special units which are also in the infantry. First, we are paying a visit to the cavalry riflemen. the cavalry riflemen are riflemen that are mounted on, well, they used to be mounted on horses, but since horses are obsolete in World War II as a weapon, they were driving around in armed personnel carriers like the M5 half-track. The unit is equipped with the grease gun that you can see here, and the grease gun was actually a M2 submachine gun, the successor of the M1 Thompson. So why is it called the grease gun? Not because it's a very greasy gun or something, but because it resembles the real grease gun, as in the tool for the engineers, which is a tool with which you can squeeze grease in small holes and stuff like that. And because it resembled that tool, this gun was called the grease gun, and that's actually some a small amount of military humor right there. The uniforms are quite similar to the riflemen, because of course they are meant to be riflemen, just armed with different weapons. Also equipped with the grease gun are the assault engineers, and we can see them right here. The assault engineers are a unit which is in a commander, and what's a bit ironic about the assault engineers is that compared to the normal engineers, they do have equipment that engineers need, like a shovel and a big rucksack with equipment for building stuff or demolishing stuff. Here are the magazine pouches for the grease guns. What's also pretty noticeable is the big light greenish stripe over the helmet. I'm not really sure what that stripe is for. There are pictures with soldiers having those stripes on their helmets, but sometimes it's just one soldier in a unit, and sometimes several. It seems like there were no prescriptions for that you had to have a stripe or not. It's also not a unit decal or something. So if you know what this stripe means, please describe it in the comments. I would be very happy to learn about it. The assault engineers can be upgraded with the M2 flamethrower. The flamethrower is a weapon that was developed in World War I. The flamethrower is a very dangerous weapon. It had more of a function of a terror weapon, because, imagine that you're in this house and this guy is going to do this. Then, that is not going to pass by without any nerves being wrecked. So the flamethrower was some kind of a terror weapon. It was also very good against bunkers or fortified positions. Sometimes the enemies that were being engaged with the flamethrower didn't die because they burned, but sometimes they just suffocated because the flamethrower would eat up all the oxygen. The flamethrower was more widely used in the Pacific than in the European theater, but that also had to do with the way the Japanese were fighting. That was a tad different from the way that the Germans were fighting. Let's go to the next unit, which is the Ranger unit. The Rangers are a special infantry group which is equipped with M1 carbines. You can also upgrade them with Thompsons, and then they get 4 Thompsons, and one guy remains armed with the carbine. What's nice about the Ranger model is that although it looks a lot like the cavalry rifleman model, there's some nice details which I'm going to point out right now. You can see here a shoulder patch. The shoulder patch is a bit realistic in the fact that the shape and the colors are exactly like the shoulder sleeve patch of the 5th Ranger Battalion. And these guys are also from the 5th Ranger Battalion. How do I know this? Because on the helmet we have this decal which says the number 5. This means that these guys are part of the 5th Ranger Battalion. So what's not realistic about the shoulder patch? Well, the icon which is embroidered on the shoulder patch is just the fictional icon that's part of the Battle of the Bulge expansion of Company of Heroes 2. And in reality here would just be the word Rangers. And there was also a special there was also a special slab that you could earn as a ranger. The Rangers were noted for some battles in Normandy. For example, on D-Day they landed in on Omaha Beach, and when they were fighting there, the infantry was pinned down, and the Rangers were in the front line. General Omar Bradley was overlooking the landing. He saw the amount of casualties and was about to call for a retreat when the Ranger Battalion broke through, and from this moment the famous sentence comes that the Rangers lead the way. So the Rangers went on to do some special operations in Normandy, and the special operations included stuff like demolishing big artillery guns on Point du Hoc, for example, where they got fooled by the Germans because they had replaced the guns with phony ones. And when we take a look at the icon, this is a nice nod to history as well, because here we can see the shoulder patch, and this is the slab. Okay, so this concludes the part about the Rangers. And now let's go to the officers before we start talking about the team weapons.
Orders!
Right here we have the lieutenant. In game you get the lieutenant if you upgrade with a certain tire. If you build the platoon command post, you get a lieutenant, as you can see here. Of course, the lieutenant is a higher ranking officer, and the lieutenant is above the sergeants, and the sergeants were usually the NCOs for squads. As you can see here, the lieutenant has a team of regular riflemen around him, and he himself is over here wearing a short jacket with some wool here, so it suggests that it's suited for cold weather. He also has netting on his helmet. You don't see any camouflage on his helmet, but the netting itself was also very useful in making the helmet less shiny in certain situations, which could save your life, of course, because a shiny helmet attracts bullets. The lieutenant himself is equipped with an M1A1 Thompson. He also has a M1911 Colt on his side, and he has binoculars, and that's because officers can give orders, of course, and orders for artillery are also very useful if you have a binocular, if you have a set of binoculars to aim at a target. Next up, ranking up, is the captain. One moment, I almost forgot. The lieutenant can upgrade with a bazooka. It's the M9 bazooka, and the bazooka was meant to be a weapon that was designed to destroy armored vehicles. Um, the first time that a bazooka entered the war was not it was not an M9 bazooka, and you can guess why, because M9 is of course the ninth model. The first model was again the M1, and the M1 was introduced in November 1942 in Operation Torch. Operation Torch was the American landing in North Africa, and whereas before the Rangers had taken part in the raid at Dieppe, which was an exercise for the later Normandy landings, which totally went awry. The successful landing in northern Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, those landings were successful, and those fights were the first fights in which the American regular army was fighting abroad in World War II. Of course, they had been fighting since December 1941 in the Pacific, but those units were either the Marines or naval units, or ground forces, naval ground forces, or ground forces of the U.S. Army Air Corps, because the American Air Branch was still part of the U.S. Army in the Second World War and only became independent afterwards. So back to the bazooka. The bazooka was usually you could fire it by yourself, of course, but it was more useful if you had one more guy with you, because then he could carry the bazooka rounds, and he could also help you reload. And what you might have seen in series like Band of Brothers or in other World War II movies is that if a bazooka guy was aiming, then the reload guy would tap the gunner on his helmet to let him know that the reloading was complete and it was safe to fire. Of course, it was pretty dangerous to stand around the guy with the bazooka, because the back blast could burn you badly. When the Germans learned about the bazooka, they wanted to imitate it, and they then went on and produced the Panzerschreck. This was a bit ironic what happened afterwards, because when the Americans captured the Panzerschreck and then did a firing test on a captured Panther, they were firing various weapons at it, and the Panzerschreck performed best. So the Americans that were present at the test then said, well, let's just ditch all bazookas and try to capture Panzerschrecks, because I'm going after the crowds with their own weapon. The bazooka was not very successful in taking out tanks. Tanks were getting up-armored during the entire war, and the warhead of the bazooka rocket launcher was simply not strong enough. So they were being used against fortified positions and bunkers, and to blow up stuff like barbed wire or anti-tank traps or other stuff that was blocking the way. Well, fun fact, the bazooka was actually designed to do that, but because the US Army also wanted something for the infantry to fight off vehicles, they started to use it against vehicles. Well, like I said, in Operation Torch they were using it the first time, and after those operations were over, not a single American could testify he had actually hit an enemy vehicle with a bazooka. So production almost ceased, but then they took it up again, and went on to develop better and better bazookas, ending up with the M9. And the M9 was actually one of the last bazookas in World War II. Okay, so this concludes the story about the bazooka. The bazooka was also deemed one of the 4 tools of victory by General Dwight Eisenhower, the other 3 being the atom bomb, the jeep and the C-47 transport plane. Okay, well then let's go to the captain now. I already introduced him a bit too fast because I forgot about the bazooka, but now here we are, and this is the captain together with his dudes. The captain can be upgraded with a M1918A2 Browning automatic rifle, and as you can see here, the captain looks exactly like the lieutenant, except for the fact that he is a captain. So uniform, binoculars, everything is the same. Here we have a guy which actually looks like the rear echelon troops, except that he is armed with an M1 Garand instead of a M1 carbine, and the other 2 guys are regular riflemen. So if we do the upgrade, one rifleman changes his M1 Garand for a bar automatic rifle. The captain was usually not very close to the fight, not as close as the other ones, of course, but they still saw some action, and the captain was usually they could wear the insignia like this here on his helmet if he wanted to. But the problem with wearing your insignia in a visible spot was that you made yourself a high value target for snipers, so very often the officers were just wearing the netted helmet, like this guy here, who just doesn't want to look into the camera for me right now. What is it, Bob? Okay. Well, let's leave him be, maybe it's not his best day. Let's move on to the last officer in the game. The last officer in the game is the Major, and the Major, let's put the Major to here. The Major has 2 guys with him that are rear echelon dudes, and he himself has a pistol equipped, which is the M1911. The Major has several abilities in the game. As you can see, he can call in reconnaissance, and he can call in artillery, which is also pretty realistic. The M1911 Colt is his main arm, whereas for most other guys it's the side arm. Okay, so the Major was usually overlooking all operations and therefore not part of the battle. This is represented by the fact that this unit is only with 3 guys, and in game you are very wise not to put them at the front, because they will die very fast, because they only have 3 guys and one of them just has a pistol. So use the Major just for the abilities with the artillery and the recon, and then you are doing a pretty realistic job. Okay, well that concludes the part about the officers. Let's move on to the team weapons. We start with the heavy machine gun. Putting the heavy machine gun dudes in the sun because they deserve it. And like with the German machine gun crew, the MG42 crew that I discussed in the German infantry video, the unrealistic thing about this squad is that they are 4 men instead of 3, gunner, spotter and ammo loader, and this guy must be like the master of the universe or something, because he is carrying the tripod, the gun, and ammo belts on everything by himself, which is a bit exaggerated. Um, well, because they were using the rifleman model, you can see that they have the ammo pouches for the riflemen, which is a bit off, because they would not need ammo pouches for M1 Garants. Except they would maybe need ammo pouches for M1911 Colts, but since they are not on the model, they are not equipped with a sidearm in this game. Okay, well guys, let's set up.
I got the gun. Grab the tripod. Let's go.
Okay. As you can see here, the M2HB .50 cal machine gun is operated while laying prone. And the M2 means, of course, it's the second model of the machine gun. HB means heavy barrel, and the .50 cal is the caliber of the bullet which is being fired by this machine gun. It's a pretty heavy caliber, and it's able to penetrate light armored or unarmored vehicles and also planes. So the 50 cal was not only used as a normal machine gun, but it was also used as a mount on vehicles, as we will see later when I'm going to discuss the American vehicles in Company of Heroes 2. Nice touch is that the tripod has these stabilizers here. The barrel has the handle here, so you can easily change the barrel when it gets overheated. It's an air-cooled barrel, as you can see here, and there's the aiming mechanism is over here, and this machine gun is very common in World War II. It was designed in the 1920s, and it's actually still in service today with several armies, and together with the M1911 Colt, it's the most widespread weapon from history, still active in modern times. So this is the machine gun team. Let's move on to the mortar teams. We have two mortar teams, and we start with the M1 81mm. Okay, guys, you are already set up, but please walk over here for a minute, and you guys can do the same, and you can walk over here. Okay. Well, just like with the... Oh, they set up immediately. These are not set up right now. And that's very good, because I wanted to point out that, like with the German mortar crews, where the Granatwerfer 34 is in game, the mortar crews are also 4 men instead of 3, and like with the MG crews, the gunner is a Superman, because he's very strong. He is carrying a bag with mortar rockets, or mortar bombs, and they are more bombs than rockets, by the way, or mortar shells. It's also a very good designation. And he's also wearing the plate and the tube, which is a bit too much for one guy usually. So one guy would carry around the base plate, one the tube, and there would be a guy dragging around bags of ammo. This is one of those ammo carriers, and he is actually doing nothing else than carrying ammo, which is realistic. The other guy is armed with an M1 Garand here in the back, but this guy here is simply running around with a lot of ammo for the mortars, both on his chest and on his back, and we can read on the tubes here that it says high explosive, and that's exactly what it was doing. It had high explosive charge. Then the M181 mortar team, you can also set up now, guys. The M1 is also again a very easily. You can very easily notice that it's the first model again because it says M1, and it's a pretty heavy mortar with the 81 millimeters. It started development right before the Second World War started, and it was a very widespread mortar in the Second World War. The M2 mortar team, which we can see here, has a 60 millimeter mortar. The 60 mortar team was developed as a successor to the 81 millimeter because the M1 was a very heavy mortar, and it made it harder for infantry units to carry it around. So between the explosion of a hand grenade and the explosion of a shell from an 81 millimeter mortar, the United States Army wished for something in between. So they started to produce a lighter version of the 81 millimeter, and the US Army was going for this 60 millimeter model. First M2 mortars were ready in January 1940. No, they were ordered in that month, and that means that they started production a bit later than the M181, but that's pretty logical if you think about the fact that they were looking for a successor of the M181 millimeter. Something which is interesting is that when they walk around, they have the Granatwerfer model, and when they put it down, it turns into the 81 millimeter model. So that's a bit nitpicky maybe, but that's of course also pretty unrealistic. The things on the mortar themselves are realistic again. The bipod, very simple. Things to adjust the height and the direction of the mortar, and also guys who are carrying ammo for the tube. Because mortars are sometimes attached to infantry units, there was, and between the mortar and the heavy artillery, the army also wanted something in between that, and that became this one, the Pack howitzer. The Pack howitzer is a small field gun, and you can see that they are setting it up, and then it can lob shells, and you can see that it's a high explosive barrage, and when it's ranking up, and you can also fire heat barrages and also white phosphorus barrages. White phosphorus is smoke, but it's also a bit it has a light poisoning effect, in the sense that it hurts people, it burns them a bit, and that makes it very unpleasant to stay in the cloud of the white phosphorus smoke. As you can see, it's a small howitzer, and it was called a pack howitzer because it was meant to be transported by pack animals like mules. So the development of this howitzer was started in the First World War. In the First World War, the Americans were using howitzers extensively, just as in big artillery, but after the First World War, I said in, but I meant after the First World War, they wanted to have a light howitzer that could be transported over heavy terrain, because in the First World War, with the muddy trenches and all, they wanted to have a gun which could be taken apart in different parts, so that they could be put in bags and then be transported by the said pack animals that I was talking about before. Okay, let's have the howitzer fire for a bit. Here you can see how it works. Shell ejects in the backside.
One of our fighting positions is sustaining fire.
And yeah, the fighting position is sustaining fire because I'm shooting at it. You can see there's a loader. And what's quite realistic is that this guy is putting his hands on his ears, because it's a very loud bang, of course, that's happening when the shell is being fired. Usually artillery crews were also standing next to the gun and then become deaf on one side because of the sustained,
One of our emplacements.
because of the deafening sound of the large explosions of the howitzers. So that concludes our field artillery piece, and then we conclude our story of the American forces in Company of Heroes 2 with the AT gun. Okay, here you can see the M1 57mm anti-tank gun. It's a pretty heavy gun, so what you can see here, that it's carried around by 2 soldiers, is not very realistic. What is realistic is what it looks like, and you might notice, if you happen to know something about AT guns in World War II, you might notice that it looks a lot like a certain British AT gun. And that's because this design was based off the QF 6-pounder of the British Army, QF standing for quick firing. The 6-pounder was a pretty successful AT gun, first used in North Africa against the German tanks, and they actually could harm the German tanks instead of the lighter AT guns that the British were using up until that point. Whereas the Americans were mostly giving stuff to the British in World War II, due to the Lend-Lease program, for example Shermans and M10s, tank destroyers, the Americans were sometimes also taking stuff from the British, and this M157 AT gun is one of those. Okay, let's have it fire at a fictional target. And then you can see that the gun is on this chassis, and it's also recoiling back. And the empty shell is leaving the gun and being replaced by a complete shell, just as with the Pak 40, which you could have seen in the German infantry video. And there is a large shield which protects the gunners, and you can also see that this guy here, the gunner, is looking through this viewport here to see if the shells are actually landing where he is aiming them. Okay, so this let me think for a little bit. I think that I have said everything that I wanted to say about the American Armed Forces when it comes to infantry, and so we conclude our story about the Americans here, and well, I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching, and have a nice day.